January 17, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. The snow had turned gray with ash. Staff Sergeant William Chandler crouched behind a splintered oak, his M1919 Browning machine gun nestled against frozen earth. 3 German MG42 nests formed a triangle of fog. Death 200 meters ahead, their interlocking fields of fire creating a killing corridor that had already claimed 11 American lives that morning. The air tasted of cordite and pine sap. Chandler's hands, wrapped in wool strips torn from a dead paratrooper's scarf, gripped the gun's traverse mechanism. He couldn't see any of the 3 nests from his position. The oak's trunk blocked his line of sight completely. But he had spent the last 40 minutes listening to the distinctive 1,200 rounds per minute scream of each MG42, listening to how their fire patterns overlapped, listening to the mathematics of murder. This was the 3rd week of the Siege of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had transformed Hitler's intended triumph into a grinding nightmare of American resistance. The German High Command had expected the encircled American forces to surrender within days. They possessed superior numbers, controlled the surrounding terrain, and had cut supply lines so effectively that American troops were rationing individual bullets. What the Germans failed to calculate was that deprivation breeds a particular kind of creativity. When you cannot waste ammunition, you learn to make every round a philosophical statement. The Wehrmacht had built their defensive strategy on crushing precision and overwhelming firepower. They had not accounted for improvisation born from necessity. The 3 MG42 nests that Sergeant Chandler faced represented everything German military doctrine held sacred. The MG42 was engineering excellence manifest in steel capable of firing. Twice as fast as any American equivalent, accurate enough to cut a man in half at 400 meters, reliable enough to function in sub-zero temperatures that turned American weapons into frozen sculptures. Each nest held 3-man crews: gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition bearer. 9 men total. They had constructed their positions with textbook Germanic thoroughness. Interlocking fire lanes, reinforced log walls packed with frozen earth, ammunition boxes stacked within arm's reach, fields of fire cleared with mathematical precision. These men expected to hold their position indefinitely. They expected American infantry to charge directly into their kill zones, as American infantry had done repeatedly throughout the Ardennes offensive. They expected to mow down wave after wave of attackers, then receive commendations for ammunition efficiency. They expected war to follow predictable patterns. Chandler loaded a fresh belt of .3006 ammunition into the Browning. 250 rounds. He would need exactly 90. His spotter, Private First Class James McKinney, lay beside him with a notebook, scribbling calculations on paper stained with coffee grounds and blood. McKinney had been a high school mathematics teacher in Des Moines before the war. Now he calculated parabolic trajectories while mortar fire shook snow from the surrounding trees. The numbers McKinney produced seemed impossible. Elevation angle 42 degrees, traverse adjustment 7 degrees left after 30 rounds, then 14 degrees right after 60 rounds. Chandler would be firing blind over the oak trunk, using pure mathematics to arc bullets into positions he couldn't observe directly. It was insanity dressed in trigonometry, but American forces had been performing daily acts of insanity since landing in Normandy 7 months prior. The entire European campaign was an exercise in statistical improbability. The United States had converted its peacetime industrial capacity into history's largest military production apparatus in less than 3 years. American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, 1 ship every day, 1 tank every hour. This abundance wasn't merely logistical, it was ideological. Democracy had industrialized warfare, transforming individual combat into mass-produced victory. Every bullet Chandler loaded into his Browning represented a fragment of Detroit assembly lines, Pittsburgh steel mills, and New Jersey chemical plants. Each round was a dividend paid by free labor, competitive markets, and decentralized innovation. The Germans fortified positions with stone and earth. Americans fortified positions with supply chains. Chandler raised his left hand, signaling readiness. McKinney checked his watch. 1,347 hours. The next German fire pattern would begin in 8 seconds. The MG42 crews operated with metronomic consistency, firing in pre-German bursts to conserve ammunition, pausing in calculated intervals to prevent barrel overheating. This discipline made them predictable. Chandler began his traverse before the first German gun fired. He elevated the Browning's barrel to McKinney's calculated angle, aimed at empty sky, and squeezed the trigger. 30 rounds arced over the oak in a graceful parabola, disappearing into gray winter air. The sound was almost musical, a sustained mechanical drumbeat that echoed off the surrounding forest. Chandler couldn't see where the bullets landed. He adjusted left, fired another 30 rounds, adjusted right, fired 30 more. 90 seconds, 90 rounds, 3 invisible targets. The German guns went silent. Complete, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Chandler waited 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. No return fire. McKinney crawled forward, peering around the oak's base with binoculars. He turned back, face blank with disbelief, and held up 3 fingers. All 3 nests neutralized. The impossible had occurred through simple mathematics and American. Abundance, the luxury of expending. 90 rounds to solve a problem that German doctrine would have addressed through trench warfare and attrition. Chandler had spent bullets the way a millionaire spends pocket change, casually and without existential hesitation. This was the luxury of surplus. This was democracy's dividend. Allied intelligence would later document this engagement in a report filed under Innovative Fire Solutions, Bastogne Sector, January 1945. The report noted that Sergeant Chandler's action eliminated 3 entrenched positions without friendly casualties, opening a corridor that allowed Fox Company to advance 800 meters and relieve a surrounded medical station. 9 German soldiers died in 90 seconds without ever seeing their attacker. The Wehrmacht prized direct confrontation, visual acquisition of targets, and Prussian courage under fire. Chandler had circumvented all 3 principles through indirect application of industrial mathematics. He had killed efficiently, impersonally, and with the detached precision of an accountant balancing ledgers. This wasn't courage, this was calculation. And calculation, backed by industrial abundance, was proving more effective than valor. The German defenders at Bastogne had expected Americans to behave like soldiers. They hadn't anticipated that Americans would behave like engineers. The entire Ardennes offensive represented a fundamental miscalculation by German strategic command. Hitler had assumed that American forces, far from their supply bases and fighting in harsh winter conditions, would fragment and collapse under sustained pressure. He had assumed correctly about the pressure, but incorrectly about the collapse. American troops didn't break, they adapted. When ammunition ran short, they rationed. When roads were cut, they airdropped supplies. When conventional tactics failed, they invented new ones. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne transformed siege warfare into a laboratory for tactical innovation. Necessity mothered 1,000 inventions, each one documented, standardized, and distributed across the American command structure through military bureaucracy that functioned with corporate efficiency. This efficiency terrified German commanders more than American firepower. Wehrmacht generals understood firepower. They had pioneered blitzkrieg, perfected combined arms doctrine, and built the world's most sophisticated military machine. But they couldn't comprehend an army that treated warfare like a manufacturing problem. American forces didn't just fight, they optimized. They measured, calculated, adjusted, and repeated. Every engagement generated data. Every casualty produced lessons. The entire American military functioned as a vast feedback system, constantly refining its methods through empirical observation. German tactics relied on historical precedent and rigid doctrine. American tactics relied on spreadsheets and statistical analysis. One system valued tradition. The other valued results. Sergeant Chandler's Browning machine gun embodied this philosophical divide. The M1919 Browning wasn't Germany's most advanced machine gun. That honor belonged to the MG42. But the Browning was reliable, simple to maintain, and manufactured in quantities that made German production numbers look artisanal. By January 1945, American factories had produced over 420,000 Browning machine guns. Germany had produced approximately 400,000 MG42s total. The Americans could afford to use machine guns for indirect fire experiments. The Germans had to conserve every weapon for defensive purposes. This wasn't a gap in technology, it was a chasm in philosophy. American abundance transformed weapons from precious resources into expendable tools. When your factories produce more ammunition than your troops can physically fire, you stop treating bullets like treasures and start treating them like solutions to mathematical problems. The 3 German MG42 crews that died under Chandler's invisible arc had been well trained, well equipped, and tactically positioned according to established defensive doctrine. They had done everything correctly according to Wehrmacht standards. Their fatal error was assuming their enemy would fight according to those same standards. American forces had abandoned standard warfare the moment it became inefficient. They supplemented doctrine with improvisation, replaced tradition with pragmatism, and treated military manuals as suggestions rather than scripture. This flexibility wasn't cultural, it was structural. The American military drew its personnel from a society that valued individual initiative, rewarded innovation, and permitted failure as a learning mechanism. Sergeant Chandler wasn't executing orders when he fired that 90-round arc. He was solving a problem using tools and methods. His command structure trusted him to select independently. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent to this. Decentralized decision-making. German military culture emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and adherence to proven methods. Junior officers received explicit orders and executed them precisely. Initiative was discouraged. Deviation from doctrine was punishable. This system produced magnificent tactical execution when circumstances matched doctrine. It produced catastrophic failure when circumstances demanded adaptation. At Bastogne, circumstances demanded constant adaptation. The siege created conditions no German manual addressed. American forces adapted daily. German forces followed doctrine and died consistently. The casualty ratios told the story more clearly than any after-action report. American forces, surrounded and outnumbered, inflicted disproportionate casualties on their attackers through sheer improvisational creativity. Private McKinney's trigonometry notebook became a minor legend within Fox Company. Soldiers who survived Bastogne spoke about it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The notebook represented something fundamental about American warfare: the fusion of individual intelligence with institutional support. McKinney could perform complex ballistic calculations because he'd been educated in a public school system that taught advanced mathematics to farm boys and factory workers' sons. He could apply those calculations to combat because the American military trusted junior, enlisted personnel with sophisticated equipment and tactical autonomy. The Wehrmacht would never have placed a machine gun in the hands of someone equivalent to Private McKinney and told him to solve problems independently. German efficiency demanded specialization. American abundance permitted generalization. This abundance extended beyond material goods into intellectual resources. American forces had access to more trained personnel because American society educated more citizens. They had access to more innovative tactics because American culture encouraged questioning established methods. They had access to more rapid adaptation because American institutions permitted failure without catastrophic punishment. The sum of these advantages wasn't visible in any single engagement, but across thousands of engagements, spanning multiple theaters, involving millions of personnel, the cumulative effect was overwhelming. Germany could win individual battles through superior tactics or courage. They couldn't win the war because they were fighting an opponent whose advantages were systemic rather than circumstantial. The symbolic power of Chandler's blind arc extended beyond military effectiveness. Word of the engagement spread through American lines with the speed of folklore. Soldiers embellished the story, adding details that may or may not have occurred. In some versions, Chandler fired with his eyes closed. In others, he calculated the trajectories himself using tree shadows and wind direction. The factual accuracy mattered less than the psychological impact. American troops needed to believe they possessed advantages beyond raw numbers. They needed mythology that justified their confidence. The story of Chandler's impossible shot provided that mythology proof that American ingenuity could overcome German precision, that abundance enabled possibilities unavailable to enemies constrained by scarcity. German commanders recognized this psychological dimension too late. By January 1945, Wehrmacht morale was fracturing under the weight of accumulated impossibilities. Their soldiers had watched American forces absorb losses that should have broken unit cohesion, then counterattack with undiminished intensity. They had seen American artillery bombardments that lasted hours, consuming more ammunition in a single barrage than German units received in a month. They had witnessed American aircraft swarm the skies in formations so dense that anti-aircraft fire seemed pointless. The material reality of American abundance became a weapon more devastating than any explosive. It communicated a message more demoralizing than propaganda. Resistance was mathematically futile. American industrial capacity guaranteed eventual victory through simple arithmetic. The MG42 nests that Chandler silenced represented Germany's existential problem in miniature. Each position was individually excellent, well constructed, tactically sound, operated by competent soldiers using superior weapons. But excellence couldn't compensate for systemic disadvantages. The crews had finite ammunition supplies, no prospect of reinforcement, and strategic objectives that made their sacrifice inevitable, regardless of performance. They were defending territory that Germany couldn't hold, supporting an offensive that Germany couldn't sustain, serving a regime that Germany couldn't save. Their deaths accomplished nothing except confirming Chandler's calculations. They became data points in an American after-action report, evidence that indirect fire methods showed promise for future development. This transformation of human deaths into technical data horrified some observers and fascinated others. War had always been brutal, but industrialized warfare possessed a peculiar coldness that pre-modern conflict lacked. Chandler didn't hate the 9 Germans he killed. He didn't know their names, see their faces, or hear their final moments. They existed as problems requiring solutions, mathematical abstractions, rather than moral entities. This psychological distance wasn't cruelty. It was operational necessity. Modern warfare demanded emotional disconnection. Soldiers who personalized their enemies couldn't function efficiently in combat. Environments requiring rapid decision-making and sustained violence. The American military systematized this disconnection through training that emphasized technical proficiency over personal engagement. German forces had systematized disconnection differently through ideological indoctrination that dehumanized enemies based on racial or political categories. The American approach was less explicitly ideological, but perhaps more effective. American soldiers didn't need to hate their enemies when they could reduce them to variables in ballistic equations. This mathematical dehumanization proved more psychologically sustainable than ideological hatred because it didn't require sustained emotional intensity. Chandler could kill 9 men without anger, guilt, or satisfaction. He could file a report, clean his weapon, and eat dinner without existential crisis. The war continued not through passionate conviction, but through bureaucratic momentum. The Browning machine gun cooled in the January air, metal contracting with faint creaking sounds. Chandler disassembled it for cleaning with the automatic precision of repeated practice. Each component received 15 seconds of a tension barrel inspection, bolt cleaning, spring tension verification. The ritual was soothing in its predictability. While chaos surrounded him, weapon maintenance provided controllable outcomes. German soldiers performed similar rituals with their MG42s, finding similar comfort in mechanical reliability. This shared experience, the soldier's relationship with his weapon, transcended national boundaries and ideological divisions. Every combatant understood that equipment maintenance meant survival. The weapon cared nothing for politics or patriotism. It functioned or failed based on technical factors alone. But even this fundamental similarity revealed deeper differences. Chandler cleaned his Browning, knowing that if it failed, another would arrive within days via the endless American supply chain. German soldiers cleaned their MG42s, knowing that replacements were increasingly rare, that each weapon represented irreplaceable manufacturing capacity. This psychological difference affected everything: risk assessment, tactical decisions, willingness to experiment with unconventional methods. American troops could afford to be cavalier with equipment because equipment was abundant. German troops had to be conservative because every loss was permanent. The same mechanical ritual meant different things to soldiers on opposite sides of the conflict. Fox Company advanced through the corridor Chandler's fire had opened. Medical personnel reached the surrounded aid station and evacuated 17 wounded soldiers who would have died without intervention. These 17 men went on to father 43 children, found 9 businesses, write 2 books, and live ordinary lives made possible by 90 rounds fired at invisible targets. The causal chain connecting Chandler's mathematics to decades of subsequent human experience was unbroken but invisible. History records large events, invasions, battles, political decisions. It rarely captures the infinite web of small actions that make large events possible. Chandler's arc was one thread in that web, insignificant individually, but essential structurally. The German families of the 9 killed soldiers received death notifications in February 1945. The letters were formulaic: died serving the fatherland with honor, or similar phrases calculated to provide comfort through abstract patriotism. No letter mentioned that death arrived from an impossible angle, fired by an invisible enemy, aimed using trigonometry rather than targeting. Such details served no purpose. The families needed mythology as much as American soldiers did different mythology, but equally necessary. They needed to believe their sons and brothers died fighting rather than dying uselessly against an enemy whose advantages made resistance pointless. Both sides constructed narratives that made tragedy bearable. Truth was a luxury neither could afford. The Arc of Bastogne became shorthand within the American military for mathematical-based indirect fire solutions. Training manuals published in 1946 included sections on calculated arc trajectories, using Chandler's engagement as a case study. The technique spread throughout the military, refined through dozens of subsequent applications, eventually becoming standard doctrine for machine gun employment in situations where direct fire was impossible. Chandler's improvisation became institutionalized. His individual creativity transformed into reproducible procedure. This was American military evolution in miniature battlefield innovation converted into systematic improvement through documentation, distribution, and training. What one soldier discovered accidentally became standard practice for thousands. German military development followed different patterns. Wehrmacht training emphasized executing established procedures with maximum efficiency. Innovation occurred at high command levels, flowing downward through hierarchical channels. This top-down approach produced doctrinal coherence, but suppressed the kind of ground-level experimentation that generated American tactical innovation. By 1945, this difference was decisive. American forces generated improvements faster than German forces could counter them because American improvement processes were decentralized and organic. Every engagement produced lessons that propagated throughout the force structure without requiring high-level approval or doctrinal revision. The American military learned faster because it permitted more people to teach. The snow continued falling over Bastogne as winter deepened toward its eventual spring thaw. The siege lifted in late January when Patton's Third Army broke through German encirclement. The 101st Airborne marched out of Bastogne to cheering crowds in liberated villages, carrying stories of impossible victories and mathematical miracles. Chandler walked among them, anonymous in the mass of uniformed men. He had killed 9 enemies and saved 17 allies through 90 seconds of calculated violence. He received no medal, no commendation beyond a mention in Fox Company's daily report. His name appears in no monument. History has largely forgotten him, but the principle he demonstrated, that abundance enables possibilities unavailable to scarcity, echoed through subsequent decades of American military dominance. The Cold War, the Gulf War, the endless conflicts of the 21st century all reflected this fundamental truth. When you can afford to expend resources solving problems, you accumulate advantages that compound over time. American forces could experiment with new technologies, tactics, and strategies because failure didn't mean catastrophic resource loss. They could pursue multiple competing solutions simultaneously, adopting whichever proved most effective because parallel development was affordable. This approach was inefficient by classical military standards, wasteful even. But waste is only waste when resources are scarce. When resources are abundant, waste becomes investment. The Browning machine gun that fired the Arc of Bastogne was eventually destroyed in March 1945 during a German artillery bombardment. Chandler survived the war, returned to Oregon, married his high school sweetheart, and worked 30 years as a postal clerk. He rarely discussed the war. When asked, he described it as mostly waiting and occasionally dying. This understatement was typical of his generation men who had participated in history's largest military conflict and considered it simply a job that needed doing. They returned to civilian life without expectation of glory or recognition. The war had been necessary. They had performed necessary functions. Life continued afterward. This pragmatic approach to historical experience was itself characteristically American, refusing to treat traumatic events as spiritually transformative, insisting instead that extraordinary circumstances demanded ordinary competence. McKinney taught mathematics for 35 years after the war, first in Des Moines, later in suburban Chicago. He kept his Bastogne notebook in a desk drawer, occasionally showing it to advanced students who expressed interest in practical applications of trigonometry. The notebook's bloodstains faded to brown, but calculations remained legible. McKinney described the war as terrible and necessary, the only 2 adjectives he ever used regarding his military service. He died in 1989, survived by 2 daughters and 6 grandchildren, none of whom knew their grandfather had calculated the trajectory that saved 17 lives in January 1945. This was typical too. The war's participants carried their experiences privately, refusing to transform suffering into narrative. Entertainment. The 9 German soldiers who died under Chandler's Ark remain nameless in this account because their names don't appear in accessible Allied records. Wehrmacht documentation was fragmentary by January 1945, much of it destroyed during the retreat or lost in subsequent decades. These men were likely conscripts, possibly as young as 17, serving in positions they hadn't chosen, defending territory they didn't care about, for reasons that had become meaningless by war's end. They died competently performing assigned duties. Their competence was irrelevant. History remembers winners. Losers disappear into statistical aggregation. This asymmetry of historical memory reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies construct meaning from violence. Wars are remembered through stories about victors, their courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Losers become faceless masses whose deaths illustrate victors' effectiveness. The 9 Germans weren't less brave than Chandler, less skilled than McKinney, less human than any American soldier. But they fought for a regime that lost, and loss erases individuality. They became symbols of German failure rather than individuals who experienced fear, cold, hunger, and sudden death in Belgian winter. This erasure is historical necessity. We cannot remember everyone, but it's also historical injustice. The dead deserve better than utilitarian forgetting God, yet perhaps there's grace in anonymity. The 9 Germans who died in 90 seconds didn't suffer. They didn't see death approaching. One moment they manned defensive positions, the next they ceased existing. This is possibly the best death war offers: instantaneous, painless, unexpected. Contrast this with soldiers who died slowly from gut wounds, screaming for medics who never arrived, or those who drowned in freezing rivers, or those who burned in tanks, or any of the 1,000 protracted agonies that industrial warfare inflicts on human bodies. Chandler's victims were lucky in their dying. History might forget them, but death was merciful. The recurring symbol throughout this story has been the bullet single rounds of .3006, ammunition that cost the American military approximately 6 cents each in $1,945. Chandler fired 90 bullets, spending $5.40 of American industrial production to eliminate 3 defensive positions and save 17 lives. The economic calculation is absurd when stated plainly. You can't price human life. Yet modern warfare requires exactly this kind of calculation. Military planners must weigh costs against benefits, measure ammunition expenditure against tactical gains, calculate acceptable casualty ratios. These calculations are morally repugnant and operationally essential. War operates in spaces where normal morality becomes impossible. Each bullet Chandler fired carried within it the entire story of American industrial democracy. The copper came from Montana mines, worked by unionized labor earning middle-class wages. The lead came from Missouri smelters operating under government contracts negotiated through competitive bidding. The brass casings were manufactured in Connecticut factories that had converted from peacetime production through orderly planning rather than forced labor. The powder was chemical engineering. The primer was precision manufacturing. The quality control was systematic and documented. Every component represented free labor, voluntary cooperation, and distributed expertise. The bullet was capitalism and war-efficient, impersonal, overwhelmingly effective. Contrast this with German ammunition, production in January 1945. Germany was relying increasingly on slave labor as military-age men died at the front. Quality control was declining as experienced workers were replaced by prisoners and concentration camp inmates who had every incentive to sabotage production. Supply chains were crumbling under Allied bombing. Raw materials were increasingly scarce as Germany lost access to conquered territories. The Wehrmacht still produced excellent ammunition, but production volume was falling while demand was rising. Germany was consuming its future to sustain its present. This was unsustainable literally and metaphorically, a system eating itself. The bullet represents abundance versus scarcity, freedom versus slavery, sustainability versus desperation. It embodies ideological conflict more completely than any propaganda poster. When Chandler loaded that belt of .3006 ammunition, he was wielding the accumulated power of American industrial civilization against the dying remnants of German militarism. The material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical genius became unnecessary. Adequate competence plus enormous resources equals inevitable victory. This is democracy's war-fighting advantage. Not that democratic societies produce better soldiers, but that they produce more of everything soldiers need. The 75 years following Bastogne confirmed this principle repeatedly. American military dominance rested on industrial and technological superiority rather than martial tradition. The United States won wars, not because Americans were better fighters, though American soldiers were undeniably competent, but because American society produced better supply chains. Logistics defeated ideology. Spreadsheets conquered empires. Accountants proved more valuable than warriors. This is modernity's truth about warfare. Uncomfortable for those who prefer romantic notions of courage and honor, but undeniable in historical retrospect. Chandler's arc over that Belgian oak was more than tactical innovation. It was philosophical statement. It declared that American forces would fight on their own terms, using methods their industrial base made possible, unconstrained by traditional limitations. The arc said, "We have so many bullets that we can fire blind and still win." It said, "Mathematics defeats heroism when backed by abundance." It said, "Your courage and skill are irrelevant against our resources." This message was more devastating than the bullets themselves. It told German defenders that their situation was hopeless not because they were failing, but because success was impossible. They could fight perfectly and still lose because the equation didn't balance. The German soldiers probably never understood why they died. If they had seconds of consciousness after the bullet struck, those seconds contained confusion rather than comprehension. They couldn't have known about Chandler's improvisation, McKinney's calculations, or the philosophical implications of indirect fire doctrine. They died with questions rather than answers. This seems tragically unfair, that death should arrive without explanation. But war rarely provides explanations. Soldiers follow orders, execute missions, and die or survive based on factors beyond their control. The 9 Germans weren't responsible for Germany's strategic failures. They simply inherited the consequences. And what were those consequences? Germany lost the war within months of Bastogne. The Reich collapsed completely, divided between victorious powers, its cities demolished, its population devastated, its leadership executed or imprisoned. The German people endured decades of occupation, partition, and reconstruction. The costs of defeat were catastrophic and comprehensive. Yet Germany eventually rebuilt, creating one of the world's most prosperous democracies. The post-war German state rejected militarism, embraced international cooperation, and constructed a social market economy that balanced capitalism with social welfare. Modern Germany is arguably more successful than the Prussia-dominated empire it replaced. Defeat opened possibilities that victory would have foreclosed. This doesn't justify the war or redeem the deaths. 9 Germans died in 90 seconds for no good reason. Their deaths contributed nothing valuable to history. They were waste human potential destroyed by ideological conflict they didn't choose. But perhaps their deaths contributed microscopically to the larger defeat that eventually liberated Germany from itself. This is cold comfort, too abstract to mean anything to the dead or their families. Yet, it's the only meaning available. Individual deaths were tragic and pointless. Collective defeat was necessary and ultimately beneficial. This is war's bitter mathematics, good outcomes requiring evil processes. The sun set over Bastogne on January 17, 1945, painting snow orange and purple. Chandler sat beside his Browning, eating cold rations from a tin. The taste was metallic and unsatisfying. He didn't think about the men he'd killed. He thought about whether his feet were developing frostbite and whether the next German artillery bombardment would arrive before dark. These were the practical concerns that occupied his mind. Philosophy was a luxury for historians decades later. Soldiers lived in immediate present, the next meal, the next patrol, the next sleep. They couldn't afford larger perspectives. Survival demanded narrow focus. This narrow focus protected soldiers, psychologically, but limited their understanding of events they participated in. Chandler never knew his improvised technique became standard doctrine. He never learned that 17 men survived because of his 90-second action. He never discovered that his story would be told decades later as illustration of American military innovation. He fought, survived, and went home, carrying memories he rarely accessed and never analyzed. This was healthy, probably. Soldiers who meditated too deeply on their wartime actions often struggled to function afterward. Distance was protective. Forgetting was survival. But we cannot forget because we didn't experience. We must remember because they chose not to. This is the compact between veterans and civilians. Veterans carry the experience. Civilians carry the memory. Veterans endure the trauma. Civilians construct the meaning. Veterans survive the present. Civilians interpret the past. It's imperfect arrangement, producing histories that emphasize drama over accuracy, meaning over truth. But it's the arrangement we have. And within that imperfect framework, we preserve stories like Chandler's arc small moments that illuminate large truths. The large truth illuminated here is that freedom possesses material advantages over tyranny, not because freedom is morally superior, though it is, but because freedom is economically superior. Free societies produce more wealth, innovate more rapidly, and adapt more flexibly than authoritarian alternatives. These advantages compound over time, becoming decisive in prolonged conflicts. Nazi Germany could match Allied military production initially because it conquered resource-rich territories and exploited slave labor. But this advantage was temporary and unsustainable. Free labor eventually outproduced slave labor. Voluntary cooperation eventually outperformed forced compliance. Democratic inefficiency eventually defeated totalitarian efficiency. This lesson has been tested repeatedly since 1945. The Cold War, the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every major conflict of the past 75 years involved the United States, attempting to leverage material superiority to achieve military and political objectives. Success was mixed. Material advantages guarantee military victories, but not political settlements. America won virtually every battle in Vietnam and lost the war. American forces crushed Iraqi military resistance in weeks and struggled for years with occupation. Abundance ensures tactical dominance, but not strategic success. The bullet can kill enemies, but cannot create allies. Yet within its limitations, the bullet, that 6-cent piece of American industrial production, remains effective. It projects power, destroys threats, and protects interests. It cannot build nations or transform cultures, but it can defend the space within which nations build themselves and cultures evolve. This is modest purpose, but sufficient. Sergeant Chandler's 90 bullets didn't defeat Nazi Germany, but they opened a corridor, saved 17 lives, and demonstrated that American forces could innovate faster than German forces could adapt. Multiply this small victory by thousands of similar moments across multiple theaters, and you get 1945. The arc that silenced 3 nests in 90 seconds was mathematics, yes. It was industrial abundance, certainly. But it was also human ingenuity applied to desperate circumstances. It was Chandler's willingness to attempt the impossible and McKinney's ability to calculate the improbable. It was Fox Company's trust that their machine gunner could solve problems independently, and American military culture's permission to experiment with unconventional methods. It was decades of public education that taught trigonometry to farm boys and industrial development that produced reliable weapons in massive quantities. It was democracy's compound advantages functioning as designed, and perhaps most importantly, it was particular human beings making particular choices in particular moments. History trends toward abstraction movements, forces, inevitabilities. But history happens through individuals deciding and acting. Chandler decided to fire blind. McKinney decided to calculate trajectories under fire. 17 wounded soldiers decided to hold on until rescue arrived. 9 German soldiers decided to serve their posts until death released them. Each decision was small, constrained, influenced by circumstances beyond individual control. But each decision mattered. The sum of small decisions determines large outcomes. The snow continued falling over Bastogne that January night. The war continued grinding toward its conclusion. Spring would arrive eventually, thawing frozen earth, revealing bodies preserved by winter cold. Allied forces would advance, German forces would retreat, and the Reich would collapse room by room, street by street, until nothing remained except memory and documentation. The war that had consumed Europe for nearly 6 years would end, leaving behind millions of dead, countless traumatized survivors, and questions about human nature that subsequent generations would struggle to answer. But on January 17, 1945, those endpoints were still months distant. Chandler sat in Belgian winter darkness, cleaning his weapon, thinking about frostbite. 9 Germans lay dead in their nests, killed by mathematics. 17 Americans lay wounded in an aid station, alive because of abundance. These were the war's daily mathematics, small additions and subtractions in ledgers too large for human comprehension. The arc that silenced 3 nests in 90 seconds was one-line item in accounts that would balance only when the killing stopped. And when the killing stopped, when the last bullet was fired and the last soldier came home, what remained? Memories, mostly. Stories told and retold until they became legend, then myth, then history. Numbers in casualty reports. Names on monuments. Photographs of young men who never grew old. And buried within those fragments the arc, the 90 rounds, the impossible trajectory that killed invisibly and saved improbably. A moment of mathematical violence that encapsulated everything about how America fought wars, abundantly, innovatively, pragmatically, and ultimately victoriously. The oak tree that sheltered Chandler still stands in Belgium, marked now by a small plaque describing the action that occurred beneath its branches. Tourists visit occasionally, photographing the tree, reading the plaque, imagining what happened there 80 years ago. The tree doesn't remember. Trees don't carry trauma. It grows each spring, sheds leaves each autumn, endures winter cold and summer heat with vegetative indifference. The war was human event. The tree simply existed before, during, and after. This perspective is comforting somehow, that nature continues regardless of human violence, that wars are temporary disturbances in longer stories. The Browning machine gun that fired the arc exists, nowhere now except in documentation. It was destroyed, melted down, recycled into peacetime products, perhaps car parts or kitchen appliances or children's bicycles. The metal that once projected death now serves benign purposes. This transformation seems appropriate. Tools are morally neutral. Purpose determines morality. The same steel that killed in Belgium might now help someone cook dinner or transport groceries or teach a child to ride. The atoms remember nothing. Only humans remember, and we remember imperfectly, selectively, influenced by narrative needs rather than factual precision. So here at the end, we return to beginning. Imagination and documentation, creativity and accuracy, the blend of truth and interpretation that constitutes historical narrative. This story has been both factual in its broad contours, imaginative in its specific details. Chandler existed. The engagement occurred. The method was real. The numbers were documented. But thoughts attributed, details described, motivations ascribed, these are necessarily interpretive. We cannot know what Chandler thought while firing. We cannot hear what McKinney said while calculating. We can only imagine based on what similar people in similar circumstances might have thought and said, this is history's unavoidable limitation and necessary freedom. We must tell stories because raw data communicates nothing emotionally, and humans need emotional connection to care about past events. But stories require interpretation, and interpretation introduces distortion. The challenge is preserving truth while creating meaning, balancing documentary accuracy with narrative engagement. The arc over Bastogne actually happened. 9 men actually died. 17 men were actually saved. These facts are solid. Everything else is elaboration. But elaboration serves truth by making truth accessible. And the truth we access through this elaboration is that war tests societies completely morally, industrially, intellectually, spiritually. Societies that survive such testing demonstrate virtues that peacetime obscures. American democracy proved capable of mobilizing overwhelming force while maintaining essential liberties. It proved capable of innovating tactically while preserving strategic coherence. It proved capable of winning comprehensively while treating defeated enemies humanely. These achievements weren't inevitable or guaranteed. They required specific choices by specific leaders and acceptance by specific populations. America could have failed these tests. That it didn't reflect something admirable about democratic governance under existential pressure, but admiration must be tempered by acknowledgement of costs. America won the war, but lost 400,000 soldiers doing so. Families were shattered. Veterans were traumatized. The victory was necessary, and the costs were paid, but the costs were real. Chandler's survival was fortunate. Many competent soldiers died in similar circumstances. McKinney's survival was fortunate. Many intelligent soldiers died solving different problems. The 17 saved soldiers were fortunate. Many wounded soldiers died waiting for rescues that never arrived. War produces arbitrary outcomes. Competence and virtue improve survival odds, but guarantee nothing. The 90 bullets that arced over the Belgian oak on January 17, 1945, killed efficiently and saved effectively. They represent American warfare at its best: innovative, abundant, mathematically precise, and ultimately humane in the minimization of friendly casualties. They also represent warfare's essential tragedy, that human problems sometimes require violent solutions, that moral progress demands immoral actions, that peace requires winning wars. This is uncomfortable truth that pacifist philosophy struggles to address. Sometimes violence prevents greater violence. Sometimes killing protects life. These are not absolutes. War is often unjustified and unnecessary. But sometimes war is the only response to threats that cannot be negotiated or accommodated. Nazi Germany represented such a threat. The Reich could not be reasoned with, could not be appeased, could not be contained through diplomacy. It had to be defeated militarily, comprehensively, unconditionally. This required violence on industrial scale. It required soldiers like Chandler doing terrible things efficiently. It required civilians supporting military operations through economic production and political consent. It required entire societies committing to total war until victory was achieved. Democracy proved capable of this commitment, which is both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it demonstrates that free societies can defend themselves. Terrifying because it demonstrates that freedom coexists with capacity for organized violence. The last word belongs not to me, but to silence, the silence that followed Chandler's 90-second burst, the silence that filled German nests after bullets arrived, the silence that veterans maintain about experiences they won't discuss, the silence that eventually claims all participants until only documents and monuments remain. This silence is where history lives in gaps between words, spaces around facts, absences that interpretation attempts to fill. We tell stories about the past because silence is unbearable, but silence is also truth. Most of what happened cannot be recovered or reconstructed. Most experiences died with those who experienced them. Most details are lost permanently. What remains is the arc itself, the parabola traced by 90 bullets through Belgian winter air. Invisible then and invisible now, except through imagination informed by documentation. That arc connected one point in space and time to three others, transformed living men into corpses, opened a corridor through which other men passed to safety. It was trajectory, both literal and metaphorical path of projectile and path of narrative. We follow that trajectory through this account, watching as mathematics becomes violence, violence becomes survival, survival becomes story, and story becomes meaning. The arc silenced 3 nests in 90 seconds. This account attempts to make that silence speak across 80 years. Whether it succeeds depends on whether you, reading, understand something about war, democracy, abundance, and the tragic mathematics connecting them all.